Hey y'all, I'm James Wright. Welcome to my shop. Today we're making this curio shelf for my Pacific Northwest tool collector's favors. Ooh, this should be fun. Let's dive in. These are favors. Particularly these ones are favors from the Pacific Northwest tool collectors. And whenever they do their best in the West, you have the chance to actually buy the favors. And so I've been starting to collect them through the years, and I'm missing a couple still, but I want to actually make a shelf to display them. These ones over here are extras that are then given to people who do a display, and I'm trying to collect those as well. But I want basically a curio shelf so I can set these up and show the little collection of interesting, cute little tools. So to start this project off, we're going to start where all the best projects start with, some 100-year-old white oak. Of course, what else would I use? I've got a bunch of it, might as well use it. Now I've got a bunch of these scraps that are just, they're leftover pieces from other projects, and actually I bought a desk a while ago that ended up tearing apart, and I'm using all of the parts that I pulled off of that for a lot of other projects. Finding old furniture alongside the road for dumpsters and trash is a great place to get free lumber. But for the back of this, I want something that's a little bit thicker than a 1/4 inch. And I'm going to make that out of 4 panels, then glued together end to end. But that means I need to resaw this down from 3/4 down to something a little bit thinner than 3/8. The bottom will be actually a bit thicker than it needs to be. I guess in this case it'll be the back. And I thought of doing it shiplap style, but I decided let's actually just go ahead and glue these together, and that would make it a little bit easier. So resawing, it's actually a lot of fun. This is about 3 foot long by about 3.5 inches wide-ish. Now we need to cut these down to length, as we need 4 panels rather than just the 2, and we can glue those all side by side. Now one of the things you want to be careful when gluing together panels is to make sure the grain is all running in the same direction. That way when you plane it, you're not running against the grain on one board and with the grain on the other. Now it's not always possible. Sometimes you're just going to run into problems, but keep that in mind when you lay them out. Try and get them running in the same direction. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, and if you can't, then you use a card scraper or something else like that to go along with it. So now we're going to joint these edges together so that we can glue them together. And the easiest way to do that is clamp them together, back to back or face to face, and then that allows you to plane them down. And if there's any deviation and you're not planing perfectly square, that's perfectly fine, because then you will have matching angles. I'm going to be using some 4/4 PVA glue, and this stuff I've actually been really liking it. You can buy it on Tools for Working Wood, and it sets up pretty quickly, and it's just an all-around nice glue. I found it to be a little bit more brittle than I generally like, but with how quickly it sets up, it functions pretty well. So we're going to clamp this down in, several clamps on top, several clamps on the bottom. Because it is PVA, we want a lot of clamping pressure. The more clamping pressure, the better. And then we want to also squeeze those joints and make sure that they all line up. The closer we can get them to alignment, the less work we're going to have to do in the future. Now we're going to go back to the sides and shelves. These are all needing to be the same thickness, which I'm going to end up being about 3 inches. So the side frame of the shelves will all be 3 inches deep, and then the shelves themselves will be about 2.5 inches deep. So we can mark them out and rip them down and cut them out. I chose the measurements I had because I had several pieces that were already cut to that measurement, so I only had to do a few more to match. So some of these you'll notice that they have table saw marks on them because I bought them that way, which is kind of nice. Actually, I didn't buy them, I found them that way because they were in a junk pile. But that's one of the great things of looking for good sources for cheap wood. I've got a couple of videos on that if you want to see more on it. But sometimes you'll find these amazing piles of wood that other people think are trash because the furniture is falling apart. Well, if it's made out of solid wood, you can reuse it again. So once we get them ripped and planed to the right dimensions, we need to then cut them to length. And my box, the frame will be 18 inches by 18 inches. So my top boards and side boards will all be 18 inches long. I don't need them to be dead on exact. So this first one I'm just going to mark and cut. And then I'm going to use that as the reality to mark the rest of them. So as long as one of them is what I want them to be, then I can make the rest of them match exactly. And it's very important that all of these boards have square ends. They are all perfectly the same length because when you're making dovetails, you need them to be perfectly square on the end. Otherwise, you're going to be running into problems with the dovetails not coming together right and gaps going out. So it's very important to square them up and make them true. Before we start doing the dovetails, I'm going to route in the groove on the back of the panels. This will be where the back actually fits into. I'm actually going to do a fully captured back on this, kind of like a drawer bottom, and that way we can then put the dovetails into either end. I like to cut the tails first. I have several videos on how to cut dovetails, and it's one of those that there's really not a lot to it. They're not a hugely difficult joint to cut. They're relatively simple once you wrap your brain around it. But for some reason, people hold them in really high regard as one of the most amazing things ever to come out of woodworking. And in reality, they work really well. They're just not the most amazing thing ever to come out of existence. There are far more delicate and difficult joints. So if you can do dovetails, then you're well on your way to doing a lot of other things. So we're going to start by cutting in the tails, and sometimes I'm going to come in with a coping saw to remove the waste in between. Sometimes I'm going to come in with a chisel. If you do really thin, small pins, I find it easier to come in with a coping saw to remove the waste in between. But sometimes I just like to come in with a chisel. Which one takes a little longer is kind of up for debate. I find that sometimes one takes a little longer than the other, and the other time it's the next one. So do I have a preferred way of doing it? Yeah, most of the time I cut them out with a chisel, but sometimes I'll do it with a coping saw. So now we can transfer those lines over to figure out where our pins need to be. And so you can set it up with a square to make sure everything is in place. Hold it down, don't let it move, mark and transfer your lines. And then it's kind of the exact same thing, except for rather than cutting at an angle vertically, you're cutting at an angle horizontally, which sometimes is a bit simpler and sometimes it's not. So here I can show you coming in with the coping saw. Stay away from the line, pop out the block. You still have to come in with a chisel and take it right back to the line. If you get really good with the coping saw, you can get really close and just have one pass of the chisel. I've not gotten that good with a coping saw. They do take a little bit more skill because they tend to be a bit more squirrely, but yeah, it's one of those things. Whenever you're working with hand tools, you're working with a skill. And the more time you spend with a particular tool, the more skill you develop with it. And the only way you can develop the skill is to do it. So jump in and have a bit of fun with it. Man, I love it when a joint actually comes together. So now we need to lay out where are all the shelves going to go. And I'm going to put in 3 shelves, which will actually give me 4 since the bottom will have it will be an existing shelf. And I'm putting them about 3 inches apart. I'm basically laying out on the board how far do I have in between. And so I mark the board in half, and then I mark that half in half, and then I put on the thickness of a board and come out with what it should be. Originally I was thinking I would make the shelves out of 1/2 inch, and that would look a little bit better, I think, but yeah, I decided to go with a 3/4 inch. It's less work. So a lot of this project, I'm just doing the simplest and most basic method. You can scale this whole project up or down to fit whatever size shelf you want, whether it's a floor to ceiling or a small curio shelf like this. It's the exact same thing. We're also going to be having a stopped dado into the sides that this then fits into. And so I'm going to be marking around the board and then cutting in an 1/8 inch on either side. So I can use the marking gauge to cut in with that. On the front edge, I'm actually going to cut in an 1/8 inch forward because we're going to have a stopped dado for these to fit into. So in reality, we're just creating a tenon on the end of this board because the board is only about 2.5 inches tall or thick or wide or whatever the dimension of that board is. So take your time, do it right, get a nice clean fit. It's important that all of them be the same size so that all of your dados can be the same size as well. It's a dado because it's going across the groove, across the grain. If it goes with the grain, then it's a groove. Kind of one of those fun things. So we're going to lay out where this will actually be and stop it from the other end. I'm going to use a saw to come in and cross cut kind of at a long angle, and that will allow me to get out most of the waste really quickly. But I still need to come back in and chop in what that can't come to. And that means chopping down and then paring out, and then chopping down and paring out. Take your time and have a little bit of fun with it. A stop dado is a very, very simple project, but once it comes together, it's kind of nice. If you want to make it perfectly smooth in the bottom, you can come into the router plane and clean that out. I did that on a couple of them, and a couple of them I said, yeah, it's good enough. So there is the main shape. Now we need to actually glue this whole thing up. So I'm going to take these shelves back out, take apart the dovetails, and we can return to the back of this. We're going to scrape the glue off. I like using a chisel bevel down and just pop pops that glue off and allows you to get close to the main surface. Then we can come into the plane and or the card scraper. And most of these joints I was able to get the grain running in the same direction, but one of them I was not, and so I have to do half of the board and then rotate around to the other half of the board. And right in the middle where those two touch, I bring in the card scraper, and the card scraper will give me a nice clean surface right up to that joint, because the card scraper can go against the grain relatively easily. And I love these curls that come off the card scraper. It's just very pleasing. Before we can do anything else, we need to establish one reference edge. We need to make sure that is true and flat, and then we can mark off of that and square out the other side. So I'm going to use my square to mark out what it is, and then we can plane that down. Because we're doing end grain, using a low angle jack really is the ticket here. I could set it up on the shooting board, however, the shooting board doesn't come back quite far enough. I need to take off 18 inches here. I'm going to mark top and bottom on this so I know. And then we're going to use pinch rods. These are phenomenal for finding out what is the actual inside measurement, because top to bottom, I want it to be tight. With the grain, I want it to be tight. I want to still leave a little bit of expansion and contraction widthwise, so that that whole backboard can still expand and contract. But when it's lengthwise in the grain, that doesn't need to. The pinch rods then let me know exactly what the reality is, making it far easier to measure inside the groove to inside the groove. So then we can come in and cut that board down to its actual exact length, and then trim it up a little bit with the shooting board and do those last final preps. And we know that this is both square all the way around, and that it is true to the exact dimensions on the board. The last thing we need to do is that this is a bit thicker than a 1/4 inch, and our back, the groove we put into it, is for a 1/4 inch. And so I'm going to grab a plane and pillow this, which means I'm just going to be working on that corner, just on that edge, and I'm taking that edge down to a 1/4 inch, and I'll keep working on that until I can slide the groove in. So I'll pull one of the pieces off of the back, and I'll make sure it fits, and I'll see I'm fitting a little bit on the corner but nowhere else. That means I'm not needing to hit that corner anymore, but I need to do the rest of it. And so we'll just keep going until the board slides all the way across and I have a nice tight fit on there. And that's really what I'm looking for. I'm going to do that to all 4 sides. When you're doing the 2 sides that have end grain, you need to skew the plane so you're not just going straight across. You're kind of going at an angle to plane it off with the grain. So now that we can pillow this whole thing, we're basically down to the point where we can glue this together. And so I'm going to be using more of the 4/4 glue. I'm going to start by gluing up 3 sides of the frame, the tail side on both ends, and then the one side of either of the pin boards. I like using these spatulas to work everything into the surface. And then I can set this up on the bench and drive the pins down into the tails, and then that will allow me to put the back in and fit that down into the groove all the way around. So then we can pound these down in. That's such a pleasing thing when we just go right down in there. Okay, a couple more taps. And then we can fit in the shelves. I can't put these in from the back like before because we now have a back on it. So I need to get them standing up in here, and then I can start working the last board down on, and then make sure they're all in alignment. And it's kind of fiddly, but the nice thing about this is now everything is held in place. The shelves can't come out. Everything is captured. Everything is locked together, and this really won't come apart. A little bit of fiddling here to get that in, but then once they all go in, it's very pleasing when it all goes down. The other thing I like about the 4/4 glue is you can clean up the glue pretty quickly. It doesn't leave quite as much of the schmoo, though I had a few spots when I got to finishing that I found I didn't clean it all up. So yeah, you do need to get into the corners and scrape it up. Now that it's out of the glue, we need to smooth everything down. And whenever you're doing the top of a box or the face, transferring from one to the other, you're going to get this skewing method in where you run down the stile and then onto the rail. And right at that transition, you turn it 45 degrees. When it comes to the tails, you always want to plane onto the board. Don't plane all the way off the other side because you don't want to plane out the end of the tails. That can be difficult because sometimes you need to go with the grain, and the grain wants to go the other direction. So that's where you can bring in a card scraper. And I like to do most of the final detail with the card scraper. I will end up hitting this with some 400 grit sandpaper just to clog the pores with dust that allows the boiled linseed oil to soak in a little bit more. Speaking of which, boiled linseed oil time. Yeah, this whole thing is going to be boiled linseed oil and paste wax. Why? Because I absolutely love the look of it, and it finishes up pretty well. We're just going to put a hanging cable on the back to pin it up, and then I've got a spot to hang it on the wall. And like that, she hangs in. And I'm really, really happy with how this came out. Put all my favors up there and put a smile on my face. Good little project. There we go. So there you have it. I wanted to keep this very simple, so there's no carving, there's no extras on here. I wanted it to be something that anyone could build. It really is very simple joinery, and you can scale this up or down to any particular size shelves you would want. It's just kind of one of those basic designs that anyone can follow. So I hope you like that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, if there's something I could learn from. I do read through all those comments, and that does help me grow. I'm looking forward to the day I get to collect all of the Pacific Northwest Tool Show favors. There's a few that I'm missing, so maybe someday this will get filled up, as well as I do have a small router plane from Veritas. I thought that kind of fit well on the shelf. That's actually a plane that I use from time to time when I need to get into small spaces. So yeah, kind of a fun thing. If you have any questions, thoughts, ideas, snide remarks, throw those in the comments down below, because that does actually help out this channel. Anytime you put a comment down there, even if it's just something like comment down below, thank you. It helps us grow. It helps us get in front of more people. It helps the algorithm. Anytime you hit the like, share, subscribe, really that means a lot. If you'd like to go even farther than that, there are a whole bunch of names over here on the side. Those are the patrons on Patreon. Without patrons or members who've clicked the little join button down below, we wouldn't exist. We are sponsored by you. Yes, you, the person watching, the people who are sponsors, thank you. Without that, we wouldn't be here. So if you'd like to find out more about that, there's links to Patreon down below, or click the little join button, become a member here. And I think that'll do it for now. Until next time, have a wonderful day. The reason it's called a curio shelf is because it's constantly asking questions. It wants to find out about the world and the things around it. So it's a very curious shelf. Boogie down, down.